Hello and welcome to Security Panel Episode 2, brought to you by Celerity. In this episode, we're going to be covering all things with early threat detection and reducing the impact of cybersecurity breaches on your business. I'm joined by two dapper gentlemen who can give us more of an insight into this area and how it's going to affect businesses in particular. I'm joined by Chris Hannett, who's Security as a Service Business Development Manager for Celerity. Quite some title there, actually. No problem at all. And also joined by Conor Champion as well, who's a client technical professional at IBM Security. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
No, thanks for coming on. So, start with you, Chris. Give us a little bit of an overview of your background in cybersecurity and sort of what led you into joining Celerity.
Yeah, okay. So I've worked in security in one way or another for nearly 10 years now. So, kind of mainly focused in and around managed services, security technology. When I first started, we were talking about things like network security and intrusion detection, and things have changed a bit since then. Yeah. So, I joined Celerity to help build their Citadel security as a service product. Just basically trying to make security more, I guess, accessible and feasible for.
Fantastic stuff. Well, thanks for your introduction there, Chris. And Conor, can you do the same and give us a little bit of an overview of what brought you to IBM?
Absolutely. So I've been with IBM Security for about 4 years now. I've done a variety of roles, starting in a sort of technical background. So we have in cybersecurity, we've got security operations centers where you're actively monitoring networks in real time against threats. So I worked as a security analyst within those, both for IBM and for within client security operations centers themselves. From there, I'm now doing a more of an advisory role before products and solutions get sold to basically advise clients on what they need to be doing with real-time threat detection. Great
stuff. Well, obviously you've both been doing it for a little bit of time right now as well. So you, as we would expect on this show, give us your expert opinions on all things with cybersecurity. Now, Chris, can you start us off? I mean, what are the biggest challenges for organizations when it comes to cybersecurity?
Well, I mean, there's so many, really. I think the main ones, really, I think the two key ones, really, it's just the pace of change, like how quickly things are changing. And I think a lot of businesses are probably feeling quite overwhelmed at how quickly things are changing. As I mentioned before, when I first started in security, it was kind of looking at the network and network security and stuff like that. I think things have changed a huge amount now to be more focused on the user, and the user's kind of the problem. And I think also with that pace of change, I think everyone's trying to keep up, but then, I'm sure you can sort of vouch for this as well. It's like actually when you put the products in place and you've got the solutions in place, it can be quite difficult to manage the outputs of it. So I think it's keeping pace and trying to make sense of what's happening is probably the main problem that a lot of businesses are facing.
Can you also sort of vouch for that there as well, Conor?
Absolutely. I think, so it's sort of two factors to the pace of change in that, one, technology moves so quickly. That's been true ever since technology's been around. And now companies are really getting to grips with that every sort of solution or process or technology or a people-orientated process has a security consideration to it. So the pace of change applies to security as well. So it's relevant to protecting environments, whether it's from a technology perspective or from a process perspective, but it's also the bad guys, it's a bit of a cliche, but the adversaries that are going to be exploiting are moving at a rate of change as well. So you've constantly got to be keeping up with developments in technology because they've only got to get it right once, I suppose, is the key point. Once they discover a vulnerability in a new piece of kit, they'll exploit that, and that will give them access to potentially the wider picture.
We touched on that on the previous episode actually, and basically covering, look, this is affecting everybody. It's not just big banks or big organisations or anything like that. It's affecting everybody. I mean, in particular though, Conor, why is early threat detection so important to organisations? I mean, we've just covered it a little bit, but why should it be on the agenda?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the key point is the impact of that breach or whatever that threat might be. And the longer it's undetected and the longer, therefore, that it's not being contained or dealt with, the more damage it's going to cause that environment to that customer or organisation, whatever it might be. Mm-hmm. So, the obvious impact is a financial related one, but there's obviously reputational impacts. There's, we were throwing around some statistics before we went on, but there's some really scary stats out there about how many businesses are affected by breaches actually go under because it's so detrimental to their operations. We've got some statistics out there so the Ponemon Institute, the cost of a data breach study for 2018, it's 197 days across a sort of sample size of about 500 companies. The mean time to actually discover a threat was 197 days. That's terrible in itself, right? But on top of that, the mean time to actually contain, once it had been discovered, it's like an additional 69 days. So you're looking at 266 days to actually detect and respond on average. And over that time...
That's basically like an entire working year.
Exactly.
And also as well, I like how accurate those figures are as well, because it puts it into real scale as well. Yeah. I mean, like you said before we actually came on, and we were having a little bit of a chat in our green room beforehand, you used the analogy of comparing it really to workplace and fire hazards really, as in physical fires.
Well, yeah, I think what a lot of people struggle with, and maybe people watching this will understand what I'm kind of driving at, is that we kind of work in security, so we're talking about security all the time. We were saying this before. It's easy to assume that people know what you're talking about, and I think the majority of people don't. So it's about kind of context, I guess, and trying to put it in the terms that people would understand in a business scenario rather than just an IT security bubble. So yeah, like you said, in terms of a fire, so let's say you're a production company, you've got a big site, you don't want that site to burn down, so you would have some kind of plan in place. You'd invest in a fire suppression system, for example, or you'd have a plan in place so that if it does set on fire, people know what to do and how to respond to it. Because the alternative is to just watch it burn down and everyone's panicking and running around, and there might be some fire extinguishers somewhere, but the point being that as a business, you see there's a potential problem and the impact that problem would have on your business, as in financial impact, loss of stock or equipment, the damage to your reputation and your customer relationships because you can't fulfill, all that kind of stuff. You can see that as a tangible problem, so you plan for it. And everyone gets that, everyone understands that, and it's putting it in the terms that the board can understand. It's not just an IT problem. It's a kind of entire business problem, just like that would be.
And from following on for that as well, I mean, what sort of questions should businesses be asking themselves in the relation to cybersecurity threats? Then, what specific questions should it be brought up in, I suppose, board level?
I think it's a similar, to bring it back to that fire analogy again, and without kind of going on about it too much, but there's an issue, and you need to look at what the potential real-term impact on your business could be if the worst happened, and you plan for that. So you plan for the worst to happen, and you plan as to how to minimise and mitigate the risk that comes from that. And it's exactly the same conversation here. So it's about looking at what would the impact be realistically. How are we geared to respond to that risk right now? Is that enough? And I would say the majority of businesses, if they're honest and they understand the problem, probably nowhere near where they should be.
You're going to add to that as well, though.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because the original question being, why is early threat detection so important? The output to detecting is responding. That is the key importance there. So when we're talking about the fire analogy or whatever it might be, all that preparation is all about the detection's obvious in something like a fire. The important bit is how do we respond? What's the plan? So the questions that you're asking in terms of a risk assessment and a sort of proactive approach, the detection is actually a means to an end, the end being the incident response plan and the actions that the company has to take to control it to minimise the impact on the business as quickly as possible.
Yeah. Chris, this is a question for you. There's so many different types of cyber threats from both outside and inside organisations. I mean, how can organisations go about combating these threats from numerous different directions, really?
It's a very good question. Well, I think you're right. I mean, there's so many different angles now, and there's, whereas it used to be, as I said before, kind of network focus, so it would be kind of like, trying to get through the firewall or whatever. Now there's so many different angles, and it might be as simple as your people are your biggest asset. I'm sure everyone has identified with that. But at the same time, they can also be your biggest risk and your biggest liability. And I think with things like digital transformation and making the move to cloud and all those good things that a business needs to do, it's kind of opening up a load of different avenues of kind of risk, I guess, and threat. So, you know, it's a combination really. You need the technology. So there are a myriad of technologies out there that all deal with very specific and equally important elements of your risk and mitigating it. So whether that be endpoint security, whether that be security awareness, whether that be, I don't know, ransomware protection, the list goes on.
Yeah.
But the point being is that you have to try and kind of mitigate risk across a number of fronts. And that is a technology, and that is also a feasibility and an operational capability question. Yeah. So you need to invest in the right technology, but you also need to be able to get something from what that technology generates. And you know, we were talking about that before with SIEM is a great example. You need SIEM for visibility and control, but also you've got to be able to manage the output of that. And
so it's, you know, I suppose before we move on to really going in depth about SIEM as well, I mean, this is a question for you as well, Conor, because, you know, I heard the other day that data is basically nowadays the equivalent of oil, really, and it has a lot of obviously wealth involved in it as well. So when data is collected from cybersecurity tools in particular, how can companies deal with, you know, the huge amount of data and spot really the potential threats, because there is so much data there? How can they go about it? Is it using technology such as AI, or is it automation? How can they go about it really and really spot where those threats are coming from?
Absolutely. So, you know, the important thing is that there is an awful lot of data. So the statistics out there that it's not uncommon for organisations to have 80 different tools from 40 different vendors. Because of the general approach to IT procurement, you know, that as being pointed out, there's an approach that a technology will fix it, it will do one thing very well, and we can deploy it, and that's the job done. And that leads to this landscape of lots of different tools that don't necessarily integrate well with each other, producing lots of noise, you know, lots of output data that might have a security connotation, it might not. And then there's a real difficult challenge with analysing that and sort of orchestrating it into an actionable response. You know, it comes back to that whole point of detection is only important when you can do something about it, you know, and the earlier you detect, the earlier you can do something about it. So, you know, the key piece of technology here, and what I'm very much involved with in my role at IBM Security, is this thing that's come up very briefly, is SIEM, you know, Security Information and Event Management Technology. And it's important in the sense that it can interpret all those different sources of information. It can take log events from these security devices in whatever protocol. You know, that there's lots of different tools out there, but essentially, you know, its value is measured on how agnostic it can be in terms of what data it can take in.
Yeah.
And the importance with all of that information is what level of analysis, what sort of understanding of security can it then present back to the processes, whether it's automated or, you know, importantly back to the people that are going to inevitably have to action.
Yeah, I mean, what other benefits though does a SIEM platform have as well? Is there anything else? Obviously, you mentioned the fact that it's pretty agnostic as well. So what else can it bring to the table as well?
Okay, so I mean, the difficulty here is I'm, you know, from a specific company. I'm from IBM, so I might accidentally slip into talking about our capabilities because it's a whole field of technology, right? There's lots of competitors in this space. But essentially, the more it comes down to, the more it can do with that information and the more intelligent it can treat that information and enrich it with external sources. So this idea of threat intelligence is using things like STIX, so Structured Threat Intelligence Exchange, to, you know, enrich the data and say, oh, we know that this address has just been contacted. We know that that's a known malicious address. We're going to present that back in a readable way to an analyst, to an automated process, so that the instant response can take place.
Yeah.
This is achieved in a variety of ways. Rule-based logic in terms of if this condition is met and this, then trigger something that tells your team, We think that there's a denial of service taking place on our web server, but it could also be anomaly based, and this is becoming more and more important as the user is being understood as a real vector and a real threat.
Yeah, that's it. And I think the key thing is, like we said, technology is massively important, but the value to a business is in the visibility and the being able to respond to something as it happens. Like we were talking about a fire before. You need to respond to a fire quickly. Yeah, because the quicker you respond, the less damage it's going to do. We were talking earlier about how long it takes on average for a business to even detect that they've got a problem, let alone respond to it. That can be a full working year. The value of breaching data is in real time, and the currency of it and the problems caused by it happen very quickly. So you need the tools in place to see you've got a problem. And then you've got to be able to do something about that.
React to it, essentially.
And that's it.
As well.
And I think, like Conor was saying, these things can generate a huge amount of information. It's being able to cut through that volume to see what you need to worry about, and then actually be able to respond to that problem. And I think realistically, nowadays, with 40 different tools or 80 vendors or whatever we were talking about before, you need an ability to actually get some return on investment from that, get some value from it. And I think now, and what we're doing with Citadel at Celerity is delivering that as a service. So having the capability to get the data and the important stuff from those tools, and be able to do something with it and react to it.
Well, this is the thing as well, because essentially what you're doing is enabling so that it doesn't get there in the first place, really.
That's
rather than when, I've heard before on other expos and shows and talking specifically about how within cybersecurity, and when there is an attack that does happen, the likelihood is you're not going to know about it in real time at all until afterwards, and you're not going to be able to react to it then.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and it's about, realistically, I mean, we talk about Celerity and it's hashtag when not if and all that kind of stuff. It's like, we're past the point of preventing this stuff. The reality is that at some point the likelihood is there's going to be a problem, whether that be ransomware, whether that be a specific breach of your data, whether that be, I don't know, one of your suppliers, your third-party suppliers, is compromised in some way, which then affects your business. You can't avoid it. So realistically now the shift is towards mitigating that risk and being able to say to stakeholders in whatever guise that is, these are the reasonable steps that we took. Yeah, these were the things that we put in place to safeguard against it. Yeah, again, like having a fire suppression system in your warehouse or whatever. Yeah, you can say, look, we mitigated the risk. Yeah, sorry to go back to it, but it's just, I suppose it's a good analogy to kind of put it in layman's terms. I guess there's a lot of acronyms and a lot of kind of this bubble around security.
It's bringing it back to basics again. Really, so
and making it, because at the end of the day, like we said before, this isn't an IT issue. This is a whole business issue. And the first steps, it's like therapy. You've got to recognise you've got a problem before you can do anything about it. And once you know you've got a problem, you can deal with it. And it's a similar kind of mindset, I guess. So that's the thing. It's kind of, how do you make sense of it? Yeah, and how do you get some value from all of that information that's generated? And realistically, for the majority of businesses that can't afford their own SOC or can't afford whatever tool, that might take their fancy, it's about getting the value as a service.
Yeah. So I'm going to put it out there to both of you, really. I mean, we spoke about SIEM just now as well. I mean, is it enough, though, to have SIEM to protect your organisation? Who wants to go first? Who wants to take this one?
An important message, I suppose. If that's the attitude, I think the short answer is no.
No, yeah.
Exactly, because of what it's there to do. It's absolutely there to give you real-time visibility and to interpret that sort of security context to what you're seeing across the network. But in order for that to function and in order for that to work, you need the things feeding. You need the network devices, whatever it might be, the applications, the endpoints themselves. You need all of those in place to feed that data, and you need those to potentially have a useful use case within security. But also you need a process-driven approach. So you need to have an understanding of actually what you want to get out of the tool, what potential attacks are you looking to protect yourself against, insider threats, malicious actor groups, these sort of things. you need to have that proactive sort of approach to let the tool be the means to the end to let you respond if an incident occurs.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely right. Like we said before, I think you need technology to be able to provide you with the visibility, to see what's happening, to see if you've got a problem, really. And then it's about what you do with that problem then, and how do you respond to it. And that is a more sort of a policy and procedure that that's kind of how do you actually get the value from that information. And I think the reality is now, with the amount of and the volume of data that's generated by these tools, and like we said before, 80 solutions from 40 different vendors and stuff like that, you can't see wood for the trees, really. So it's kind of, how do you make sense of it? And I think the reality is that now more than ever, it's about the right technology to give you the right visibility to be able to have the right controls. And for the majority of businesses, that the realities of actually doing that is to have security consumed as a service, really. So you kind of you're effectively outsourcing the monitoring of that information and seeing whether there's a problem to a partner that's geared up to do that full time, not as part of your job as an IT manager or whatever, which is more often than not an operational, keeping the lights on, keeping the email going,
Well, a lot of time IT managers, they have jobs within jobs as well. They're looking after teams, holiday, sick, whatever, and software development, all that stuff in-house, and then they've got this to deal with.
But that's it. And, contacts that I deal with on a regular basis, an old customer of mine in financial services, they would have 70 projects on at any one time. And only a certain percentage of those would relate to security. They might be doing cloud transformation or hyperconvergence or whatever it is. I don't know, new storage, data, disaster recovery, whatever it is. Security is part of a bigger data protection conversation. And I suppose that's kind of, from a Celerity perspective, that's where we're approaching it from. It's we've got a very good pedigree in data protection, data management. And then you take that in as security becomes part of that conversation, rather than it kind of this standalone bubble over here that's security on its own, and it's about the value to the business. The executives in a business, and even the IT manager in a lot of cases, the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty bits of security don't necessarily matter. It's about the outcome for the business and deriving some value from that, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, I mean, Conor, from your standpoint as well, from obviously IBM, are companies investing in cyber threat detection more often than not, though? Because we covered it slightly earlier on, but is it something that they're going, wow, we've really got to do this, or are we just seeing a trend? And I suppose it varies from company to company, but
it is a difficult one. I mean, I think it's the classic of trying to put across the idea of something that might happen.
Yeah.
I mean, the reality, though, is that this is happening more and more. And the actual threats that are active and out there are becoming more and more advanced themselves. So traditional ways of protecting perimeter controls, firewalls, sort of limiting sort of access, these sort of approaches are very are not appropriate for these advanced persistent threats that exist now. To sort of throw a few statistics in there, the IDC recognise that I think across all industries it's about 10%, but they're recommending IT. So 10% of an IT budget is spent on security, and that's an average again, and that's okay. But they're recommending it should be at 15% even now, and that's going to grow because of this recognition that it is getting more of a problem, and that it is underpinned into everything that's happening. It not only is it really negative for it to be an afterthought, it just doesn't work as an afterthought, because then you've got things such as insecure software development, which vulnerabilities will be exposed in, gaps in your visibility, gaps in your network that are going to be exploited.
Essentially what we're saying is simply doing it as an afterthought kind of doesn't really work as well.
It is the definition of closing the gate after the horse has bolted. There is no point. And unfortunately,
another great analogy there for you, Chris. I love it.
But I think it's important to kind of get it across that. I mean, I deal with customers on a daily basis. New potential customers is part of my remit, and what you find is there's still, even 10 years into working in security, there's still this kind of perception that, well, the hackers won't want anything we've got. And we've got security controls in place because we've got a firewall and we had a pen test a year ago. That's not enough, simply put. I think there's still this preconceived idea that because we haven't had a problem yet, we must be fine. And that's a dangerous position to be in.
Are we seeing a way in the way how cyber criminals are changing up or mixing up their approaches and tactics in attacking organisations too?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this comes back to that original kind of key problem of quickly changing environments. What's really quite common now, and as a subject area in itself, is sort of this idea of living off the land. So threat actors and criminals will be using existing processes and vulnerabilities in sort of controls that are in place in order to get a foothold, laterally move along the network, and therefore, gain, escalate privileges and then exfiltrate data. And the really scary thing about that is with sort of filter controls and looking for malware signatures and so on, is that these are legitimate things that have to work for the network to operate. And that's what the cyber criminals are sort of pivoting on. So you need a sort of enriched monitoring of both the internal network as well as what's going outside to understand those sort of different vectors of attack. I mean, it's still really common because of the nature of addressing risk and from a attacker's perspective, what's the easiest way of getting in? It's still massively the majority of attacks take place through a social engineering vector.
Yep.
So through phishing emails, through using data exfiltrated from a different breach to kind of build that trust and therefore get people to hand over information.
You just sort of mentioned it there as well, this sort of internal threat, I suppose, as well, and some of that maybe can come down to education part of it being and stopping it from that. I mean, what are organisations from both your standpoints, from both your companies? I mean, what's your thoughts on what your clients are thinking about these internal threats? Is there a seriousness taken about that properly, or is it is it mainly, do people think of it just mainly as outside?
Okay, yes, I understand what you mean. Yes, the tendency is that it's trying to stop the bad guys getting in, and that's sort of firewall mentality and stuff, which again is still an important part of the picture. It's just that picture is getting bigger all the time. So I think the reality is that there's a reason why there's all these data breaches. I think there's a big piece of the puzzle missing when, I don't know, Marriott has 500 million email addresses and user credentials stolen. It's kind of like, oh no, that's really bad. And then it stops there. There's a point to stealing that information. One is that it has a tangible value, so on that sort of, dark web or whatever you want to call it, where there's a marketplace for that data, and each record is a way of generating income for these criminals, and it's a fairly risk-free way of generating a lot of money. So why would they do it, or why would they not do it? But there's again, we talked about it before, there's a shift towards the user, and the point being that if you've got real credentials, so a username, a password, data about an individual person that physically works at a business, you've got a key to that network, whether that be directly into their network straight away, or whether that's through a third party by going through a cloud service or whatever that they use. And then it's like a staging. We've talked about it before on camera. It's kind of like you see on a film where you get the employee to steal the blueprints to the bank vault or whatever, so you can then what to do, and you can start your plan.
The inside job.
Exactly, and that's it. And it's like, if you've got those blueprints, or you've got an ability to get those blueprints, it's then a staging point in what could be a myriad of different things that you wanted to achieve. So it's kind of like, this perception of the bad guys trying to get in is right, but it's also, once they're in, what they're doing, and being, and again, that links back to SIEM and activities on the network. And
anything to add to that as well, quickly, Conor, before unfortunately we have to wrap things up shortly, but have you got anything you'd like to add to that as
Definitely, yeah. So to bring it back to the insider and detecting that threat is difficult, because these insiders, whether it's accidental or malicious, they've got those credentials, they've got those rights and privileges to access confidential information in some cases, to transfer funds for the company, etc., etc. All of those accesses already exist, and they need to exist. They need to do their job. From a detection and from a cybersecurity perspective, that's really difficult because you can't rely on abnormalities that are obvious. Binary matches of signatures and so on. You have to rely on changes in behavior. So, this user never communicates with this external address, and they shouldn't need to for their day job. Let's investigate this. But for that whole scenario that I've just thrown in a sentence, you need to know what a normal user's responsibilities are. You need to have real-time monitoring of those activities and to actually be able to correlate that to, we know that this is John Smith at this address and he's a sysadmin, so these are the responsibilities he should be doing. And when you understand all of those things actually having to be correlated, interpreted, and then producing an output, as quickly as possible if something malicious or John Smith has accidentally just sent loads of confidential information by sending the wrong email, it is a cliche, but it is then, a ticking clock in terms of as quickly as you can respond, you need to have that detection. And it's an interesting case because I think, the original question, are people taking this seriously? I mean, the cybersecurity industry is taking it very seriously because most, there's statistics out there where 60% of data breaches are from the inside, whether it's malicious or accidental. Sure. And then how do you do that? How do you detect that? And it brings you into the sort of advanced capabilities of certain SIEM technologies out there, using things like machine learning to propagate a timeline of a user behavior and then point out when an abnormality takes place. Advanced stuff that cannot be done without real-time detection, without data sources feeding that information in and actually interpreting it.
Yeah, it's all incredibly interesting stuff, and like you rightly said there as well. Obviously, it's incredibly important to cybersecurity companies, and I think the message is getting out there to businesses as well and to end users to take care and basically think twice, really. But gentlemen, unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things up now anyway. It's been a pleasure having you on. It's been really good from my perspective to learn a little bit more, and I think we've had a great chat.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
No problem. So, guys, that was Security Panel. Join us next time for another episode where we're going to be discussing all things with cybersecurity. I'd just like to once again thank my guests, Chris Hanna and Conor Champion as well. Gentlemen, once again, thank you very much for joining me. But yeah, join us next time where, again, we'll be discussing more interesting stuff with Celerity. We'll see you then.